I remember that night like it was yesterday. I was 8 years old, and like most kids my age, I hated being alone at night. But that night, well, it was different. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching me from the shadows. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination running wild, as usual. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m., when I first heard the noise. I had just finished reading my comic book and was trying to sleep in my room. My parents weren't home, at least that's what I thought. They were supposed to be out with my older brother, but they were running late. I figured they were stuck in traffic, or maybe my brother was taking longer to get out of the hospital. You see, my brother had been in a car accident earlier that day, and my parents went to check on him. The house was quiet, too quiet, except for those odd noises. At first, I thought it was my parents coming back, their footsteps echoing through the hall. I pulled the blanket over my head, comforted by the thought that they'd soon be back. But then, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard the door creak open, like someone was sneaking in. I thought, maybe they forgot their keys again. But then, something fell off. I heard voices, two voices, talking quietly in the kitchen. I didn't recognize the voices, but I figured maybe it was just a friend of my parents, someone who had come to help with my brother or something. I rolled over and tried to fall asleep again, waiting for the sound of my mom's footsteps down the hall. But the voices didn't stop. They were muffled, like they were right outside my door. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear a tone that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound friendly. I was scared, but I told myself it was nothing. My parents would be back any minute, and everything would be fine. But the noise didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. The door to my room creaked open, and I froze. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could hear the faintest shuffle of footsteps getting closer. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Maybe it was just my mom checking in on me, but that didn't explain the stranger's voice, or the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping across the floor, followed by a muffled conversation. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it didn't sound like my parents. Panic slowly crept in as I realized something was very wrong. I waited, feeling my heart race. Then, without warning, I heard the front door open again, followed by the slam of a car door. I didn't know what to do. I knew my parents hadn't come home. They couldn't have, but who else was in the house? That's when I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, like someone was walking towards my room. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and my breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they were inside, and I had no idea why. When the door to my room slowly creaked open, I knew I had to get out of there. I jumped out of bed, but before I could move, I heard my parents' voices from the front of the house. I froze in the hallway, heart in my throat. When they finally came in, my dad immediately called the police. I didn't know what had happened, how someone could have gotten into the house, but the officers couldn't find any sign of a break-in. There was no damage, no theft, no evidence of anything unusual, except for the feeling that we weren't alone. They said it might have been a mistake, or maybe someone was just trying to scare us. But I knew the truth. Whoever had been in the house that night, they weren't after anything material. They wanted something else, and they knew exactly where to find me. The police never caught the person, and no one ever explained why I heard what I heard. But I'll never forget that night, or the feeling that I was never truly alone in that house again. It started with a simple photo, just an old-school picture my brother found in the attic one afternoon. I didn't think much of it at the time, just an old relic gathering dust. But that photo, it changed everything. I remember that evening perfectly. My younger brother, Max, had been rummaging through boxes in the attic when he found it. He came downstairs holding it, his eyes wide, like he'd just uncovered something fascinating. The photo was of a boy I didn't recognize. His name was written in the corner, Buddy. Max seemed fascinated by the picture, almost mesmerized. He began talking about Buddy as if he were a real person. He kept saying things like, "Buddy will help me," or "Buddy says he wants to play with me." At first, I figured it was just some phase. You know, kids and their weird imaginary friends. But then, things started getting strange. Max started talking to Buddy at night. He would sit by his window, chatting away in a hushed voice like Buddy was right there with him. At first, I thought it was just normal kid stuff, but then I heard something. A toy car, Max's favorite one, started making noise in the middle of the night. It was spinning across the floor by itself, as if someone were pushing it. I rushed into his room, but Max was fast asleep, and the car had stopped moving. I asked him about it the next morning, and he just smiled and said, Buddy was playing with it. That was the first moment I realized there was something off about Buddy. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, but Max seemed so convinced that Buddy was real. We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The weirdness didn't stop there. A few nights later, we were all in the living room when a loud crash came from the kitchen. We rushed in to find the George Foreman grill on the floor, thrown across the room like someone had hurled it. Max stood there, wide-eyed, and said, Buddy did it. He didn't like it being on the counter. I tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the dog, or maybe someone had knocked it off the counter by accident. But something deep in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. We started noticing more things. Objects moved around, lights flickered, and doors would open and close by themselves. Every time something strange happened, Max would insist it was Buddy. Buddy wanted to play, he'd say, but this wasn't a child's game anymore. We decided to throw out the toy car, thinking that maybe it was the source of all the noise. We figured it would stop Max's obsession with Buddy. But the next morning, the car was back, right in the middle of the living room floor. Max grinned and said, Buddy got it back for me. My heart sank. How was this possible? There was no way he could have gotten it. It had been in the trash the night before. One night, I went to check on Max, and I saw him sitting at the edge of his bed, talking to Buddy again. Only this time, there was something different in his voice. Something darker. Max's face was pale, his eyes wide as if he wasn't talking to an imaginary friend anymore. He was listening, responding to something, or someone. I froze in the doorway, not sure what to do. Was this really just an overactive imagination? Or was there something more sinister at play? The next day, we found more things out of place. Doors unlocked when they were always shut. The smell of something foul lingering in the air. And Max, he wouldn't stop talking about Buddy, about how Buddy wanted to help him. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Buddy wasn't some innocent imaginary friend. There was a sense of dread growing in the house, like the walls were closing in on us. I started doing research, looking for any signs of something darker. And I found something. There was a strange pattern. Buddy had been a name in local legend, tied to a series of disappearances in the area. Children who had vanished years ago, their stories always involving a mysterious Buddy who had played with them before they disappeared. I couldn't believe it at first, but after reading everything, I was terrified. I confronted Max about it. He said Buddy was just playing, that Buddy was his friend. But the fear in Max's eyes told me the truth. Buddy was not just a friend. He wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He was something else. Something that wanted more than just attention. That night, I made sure to lock every door, check every window. But when I checked on Max, he was gone. His bed was empty, the room cold. And the only thing left behind was an old photo of Buddy lying on the floor, as if someone had dropped it there. To this day, I wonder if Max was taken by Buddy, or if Buddy was never just an imaginary friend, but something far worse, feeding on the fear, waiting for someone else to believe. It all started with a new neighbor named Alex. I was 10 years old, still figuring out what kind of friends I liked. When I met him, he lived 2 houses down, and at first I thought he seemed cool. He was a bit older, maybe 12, and his house was this huge, old place with ivy creeping up the sides like it hadn't been touched in years. I didn't think much of it then, but I should have. We became friends quickly. Alex was always around, and he seemed to know things I didn't. His eyes were intense, too intense for someone his age, like he was always watching me from the corners of his eyes. I remember feeling uncomfortable at times, but I brushed it off. He lived alone with his mother, and their house, it wasn't right. It looked like no one had cleaned in ages. The air smelled stale, like something forgotten. But Alex never seemed to mind. It was as if the mess didn't bother him at all. At first, I thought it was just his way of living. But then, he started acting strange. He would show up at odd hours, always when I was alone. His visits became more frequent, more intense. I started noticing little things that weren't quite right. He'd show up uninvited, staring at me for what felt like forever, as though he was searching for something in me. One night, he came over late after my parents had gone to bed. I was lying in my room when I heard a tapping on my window. I opened it, thinking it was just the wind. But Alex was standing there, grinning up at me like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Can I come in?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. There was something unsettling about the way he asked. I told him no, that it was late, and he just stood there for a moment, staring at me through the glass. But then, something happened. The window unlocked on its own. The latch clicked, and Alex slipped inside without a sound. He stood in the center of my room, his hands moving almost in a strange dance, like he was trying to conjure something. "Let me sleep here," he said, his voice soft but firm, as if there was no room for refusal. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told him to leave, but he didn't listen. Instead, he crawled onto my bed, pulling the covers back like it was his own. It felt wrong, like something supernatural was at play, like he wasn't just a boy anymore. The next morning, I told my parents, and they were furious. They confronted Alex's mother about what had happened. She seemed distant, almost like she didn't care. "Alex is just going through a phase," she said, but I didn't believe it. My parents didn't take it lightly and warned her that if it happened again, they'd call the police. But Alex didn't stop. If anything, his behavior grew worse. He would show up unannounced, watching me through the window, standing just out of sight, like he was waiting for me to invite him in again. His eyes were darker now, like something ancient and otherworldly was hiding just beneath the surface. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The window had been shattered, and there, standing on the other side, was Alex. He crawled inside, his movements smooth, unnatural, like he was being controlled by something I couldn't see. I screamed, but he didn't react. He just stood there, a twisted smile stretching across his face. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt a coldness spreading through the room, as if the air itself had changed. I realized then that Alex wasn't just a boy. He was something else, something that wasn't bound by normal rules. My dad came rushing in, furious, and pulled Alex away from my room. He demanded answers from Alex's mother, who still seemed unaffected by the whole situation. She agreed to pay for the window, but I could see the flicker of something behind her eyes, something dark, something that hinted she knew exactly what Alex was capable of. I'd never been able to shake the feeling that Alex wasn't human. That night, after everything calmed down, I sat in my room, staring out the broken window. It had been repaired, but I couldn't stop thinking about Alex. What was he? Where did he come from? And why did he keep coming back? Now, years later, I still wonder what Alex's future holds. Was he born this way, Or was he something else entirely? Every time I hear a faint tapping at my window, I wonder if it's him, waiting for me to let him in once more.